left us five with the sort of very simple task of how to organize a whole city on a Friday afternoon at 6 p.m. It's very simple. I'm sure that we'll be able to cover that thing. Undoubtedly, it's a very, very important question. And of course, as Peter Marcuse reminded us in the morning, it's more complex, after all. The complexity is in there, but undoubtedly there's been, as the description of the event puts forward, an incredible global uprise on taking the city as the canvas has always been, and I guess it's closer to what Henri Lefebvre suggested in his very good book, The Urban Revolution, that the revolution might come in the cities. And we have seen uprises all over the world. And it's a very relevant question to ask, not only for us here in the front of the panel, but I guess for you in a much sort of interactive form. I hope that questions arise and that we'll come up with the answers and we just go out there and take over in the city. And so tomorrow we just festivity at the new school. Okay, my name is Miguel Robles Duran. I will be chairing this panel. I'm the director of the Urban Ecologies graduate program at the new school. And I'm gladly co-joined the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, the BREC Forum, and the Right to the City Alliance, Growing Roots also, in the organization of this event. And it's something that we believe has a lot of potential, not only for this time, but I guess going ahead, as David mentioned in his introduction. To introduce this panel, I chose to do some visual stuff. I'm not giving a talk, so if I take too long, just start this. I'm chairing the event. And then I will introduce each of the speakers as they come. Okay. I thought that it was very important with a question, to start with something that had inspired my practice for at least the last 10 years or or even more, which has been the fortune that I've had in the middle of last decade to travel to Santiago de Chile for the first time, and then in a series of travels that I made to Santiago de Chile. And the idea of the travel was actually to study the urban struggle in no place than the cradle of what we called neoliberalism, and we continue to call it. Who knows what is going on, but at that time, it was very interesting to see how urban development, what shapes urban development had taken in Santiago, and mostly to understand resistance and struggle, and if there were some issues that actually managed, or there was some organization that managed to resist the incredible forces and authoritarian forces of Pinochet regime. And of course, backed by the lady behind me and other people around. This is Margaret Thatcher, for those of you who don't recognize, overlooking the Docklands project. Very nice, very nice. And, we have here Santiago de Chile with Pinochet sitting on a table. Who knows what they were discussing. But I want to point here that we're talking about a process, what I'm going to be sort of using as introduction, that began in the 50s. Pinochet's coup, internationally assisted coup, took over in 1973. And when he took over, one of the main agendas was actually the transformation, economic transformation of Chile through, of course, privatization, all these sort of things that we have gotten to know that neoliberalism does, and does very well. It was set up as almost like an experimental place. Now, part of this was the complete reconfiguration of the urban realm. The forces or the intentions that they had is pretty much about 1/3 of Santiago's population at the time was made of informal settlements. And literally, they set up to a task of eliminate all informal populations, not only to liberate land for investment in the middle of the city, but also to set up a pace on where did the poor belong and where the new investment will come. Most of the times it went, of course, to the periphery of the city. He managed actually to move around 1/5 of the population, a little bit more than 1 million people. Most of it began entering the 1980s. And it just continued. There was, in Santiago, despite Pinochet's terror-like actions, against, of course, the poor and the dissident, etc. One centrally located neighborhood that stood out, perhaps you have heard of it, perhaps not, stood out fighting and ultimately winning against the brutal and authoritarian force of the Pinochet's regime. The name of this neighborhood, of this commune, because that's the configuration, the political configuration they use in Chile, it was called La Victoria, and was founded in 1957 by more or less 1,200 families that squatted, basically took over, occupied a piece of land in central Santiago. Enacting, well, it became much bigger immediately afterwards, but these 1,200 families, what they did is that they enacted the first organized occupation in Latin America. It's history. Now, what continued with this occupation and its constant struggle, it would serve as the primary model for thousands of citizens for other sectors of the city, the country, and Latin America. I'm quoting right now the Uruguayan journalist Raúl Civecci, who says, the pattern of this organization consisted of collective organization prior to the seizure, careful selection of suitable space, and sudden action, preferably at night, along with search for a legal umbrella of relations with churches or political parties, and the elaboration of legitimizing discourse for an illegal action. If the seizure withstands initial eviction efforts by public forces, it is very likely that the occupants will be able to remain. Its successful influence of La Victoria in Santiago alone is reflected by 312 occupations that mobilized 54,710 families. If you make a count of the size of a Latin American family, that's a lot of people. And this mobilization happened until Pinochet's coup. Right? So basically from its foundation in the 1950s until 1973. Now, ultimately, this form of self-built, self-governed neighborhoods, and I have to stress here, not autonomous. It was not a neighborhood that was set to be a part of the city, as we know many, and as many of you perhaps have studied those places that sort of separate, that create an autonomous community and their own sort of mode of being. They were actually engaged completely in training other communities. They were part of the network of informality that was resisting the forces of capital at that time. Now, this thing, what it ultimately do was to, I would say, replace the factories of Santiago at the time as the epicenter of popular action. So it created that the neighborhood itself, before Pinochet came in, was the epicenter of popular action, and before that it used to be the factories. So suddenly the struggle sort of arrived in the city, it was very, very tangible there. Now, this is the beginnings of the dreaded informal that we are, well, many people are enemies of now. In my town where I grew up as a teenager, Tijuana, Baja California, in Mexico, we used to call them paracaidistas, no? The parachuters, the guys that just come in and take over land in massive scale. And this is something that is not very used in the US. Perhaps there are some, of course, exceptions. Now these self-built, self-governed neighborhoods somehow managed to create a very, very close and tight resistance systematic organization. By 1983, 10 years after Pinochet's internationally assisted takeover, the population of La Victoria had an incredibly robust system of resistance. By then, mostly women and children, due to the frequent disappearance of men as they went out of the neighborhood to look for food and for resources. So most women were left there and children. These were organized block by block, house by house. Each block had its role in the resistance. Some focused on food, some focused on health, education, and communication, while other blocks or other houses focused on, were in charge of the security of the commune, the vigilantes. There were spy networks, code language production, direct confrontation brigades, hiding systems, and the like. Between May and October of 1983, a series of anti-Pinochet protests were organized. Quoting again this journalist, Civecci, he said, the state response, Pinochet at that time, was brutal. Slightly over a year later of these organized things, there were at least 75 dead, more than 1,000 wounded, and 6,000 arrested. In a single protest in one day, in 1983 in August, 1,000 people were arrested and 29 killed. 18,000 soldiers participated in the repression against the civilians of these neighborhoods, not including the national police entering this. La Victoria resisted and triumphed. Let me be clear here. A collective of roughly 20,000 organized citizens triumphed against one of the most repressive and ruthless, well-backed American-British regimes of the past century. My conclusion at that time, and I guess it's still somewhere here, what I read, what I found out there, is that they had formed something that I have been incredibly interested on since, which is the closest thing to the inspiration which brought us into what we like to call an operative urban union. Let me introduce this concept, an urban union. What does that mean? They organized around media, communications. This is one pirate radio station that they have right there in La Commune. Around media, communications, foods, jobs, economy, public space, transportation, healthcare, education, criminal justice, housing, art, environment, democracy, and governance. All topics of tomorrow's workshop at the New School. There you go. What is key here, of course, is the situation that, for whatever reason, no matter how they did it, they managed to tackle all these topics as a relational, sort of systematic condition. Not looking at each topic as we're normally used to do, in fragmented forms, because this is what capital always teaches us. We can only operate and go against housing, go against this, whatever, but it's very difficult to come together. Thus, we're not part of the topics that we're going to discuss tomorrow. In my professional practice, I co-direct a non-profit organization based in the Netherlands with 4 other members. We were incredibly excited, and we started to work in projects on organizing urban unions. We started this project in the late 2000s, in the decade of 2000s, where we started to work, let's organize people on labor and urban rights and space, and started to create these sort of very fantastic, incredible diagrams. I would just pass them through of looking with, parks and campaigns and outreach and, modifying all this stuff. Space, urban rights, art, this can go on and on. I'm just showing different projects that we have worked on with our obsession to create this urban union. Ultimately, what we have struggled against when we come with this sort of beautiful organization, we have syndicates and people, etc., is that we're too small. I mean, we can organize 12 people, 14 people, sometimes 20 people, work in the scale of a neighborhood. But here we're talking, well, if I compare to La Victoria, we're talking about 20,000, which is not a lot, I must say, people. And fighting for the reception of a possibility of the construction of an organized system, an organized concurrency of people that could go beyond just a simple practice trying to do things. And this is where I guess I'm leaving. I want to quote, if you recognize the man in the picture, I think it's a surprise. This was May 1st, last May 1st, carrying a sign in Spanish that said, La ciudad nos pertenece, the city belongs to us. We must not forget, and I want to set this tone to the panel, we must not forget that we are all urban workers. We are the ones that produce the city, after all. As David wrote in his latest book, urbanization is itself produced. Thousands of workers are engaged in its production, and their work is productive of value and of surplus value. Why not reconceptualize the site of surplus value production as the city and not as the factory? So I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is Rob Robinson, Special Advisor of the Human Rights to Housing Program, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, NESRI, and co-founder of Take Back the Land movement. Rob, please, take a seat.
I'm going to ask for some help here because I don't use Macs, so somebody get the slideshow going for me, just to the point where I can hit enter and I'm good to go. All right, so thank you, Miguel, and good evening, everybody. My name is Rob Robinson. I'm the co-founder of the Take Back the Land movement, and before I go forward, one thing I always do publicly, and I just don't think we do enough as people, is thank the people that gave me the opportunity to be here. So I want to thank David and the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics for allowing me to be here, the Brecht Forum, and the Right to the City Alliance. And you know, as I go through this PowerPoint that I'm going to show you in my little speech, I'm going to talk a lot about academia working with Take Back the Land because it's been an important part of the work that we do. The other thing that I say very publicly is people in the movement will tell you all academia does is spew theory at you, but I love to be in spaces with people like David, Miguel, and people like Neil Smith because they just encourage me to think and help me to form the ideology and the political thinking that I have. So I want to thank you guys on behalf of that. So with Take Back the Land, what we look to do is we look to transform relationships to land. We believe that land is at the center of the economic problems in this country. 1% owns the land, 99% of us are asked out, right? So poor people in poor communities will remain impoverished as long as they can't control land in their particular communities. So what we do at Take Back the Land is we do land liberations, we do eviction defenses, and we defend people's rights to stay in homes, or we reclaim vacant spaces. And in that instance, we look for spaces primarily that were foreclosed by a bank or a government institution. We break in them, we move families in, and then we engage in very public campaigns for that family or the people that we moved in there to stay in there. So with the Take Back the Land movement, we have two particular objectives, as I stated earlier. One is to elevate housing to the level of a human right. I was speaking to Miguel prior to this panel starting, and we don't talk a lot about human rights. We don't use the human rights frame in this country a lot. You know, as I started to get involved with Take Back the Land and we started using the human rights frame, people would respond to that. That's something they use in Europe, that's something they use overseas. But we have rights from the very fact that we were born, right? And I think it makes it easier, as Miguel talked about organizing these unions. I think what the human rights frame does for us is allow us to organize against structures. It takes us away from organizing in those particular silos around labor, around education, around housing, and says, what are those structures that we need to remove so that we can achieve what it is we want to achieve, so that we could see the community look the way that we want it to look. And the human rights frame allows you to do that. We look to build a movement that's going to advocate for these particular objectives. Take Back the Land is not an organization. We are not a 501c3. What we are is a trans-local network of grassroots organizations from around the country that want to engage in this particular work. We enter into an agreement. People have to have the same political ideology as us. They have to believe in our organizing style, and they have to believe that campaigns with direct action focus are going to move us to where it is we want to be. Miguel, come back. I got stuck. That's it, just hit the, okay, spacebar would be easier. Okay. So what we do is we create what we call a SPARE method of organizing. At the tip of this SPARE, at the top is where we're going to start, and that is by using what we call positive action, non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. That is going to create the tension or agitate enough so that we can start to have the dialogues around public policy and the alternative structures, the places that we want to go. With public policy, laws are written not necessarily to work for you. In many instances, they're written to work against you. And that's why we engage in this direct action and civil disobedience, right? We want to highlight, we want to put that law out there and say this law was written in a way that doesn't work for our communities, but we're willing to take the risk to make the change. Take Back the Land makes it very clear that we don't want to engage in the dialogue with those policymakers. Our feeling is you got us in this mess in the beginning. To begin with, we don't want to talk to you. But we form strategic partnerships with policy organizations that believe in the same ideology that we do, and we trust that they will go in and work on those policies on our behalf. To that instance, NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, is a strategic policy partner of Take Back the Land. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty is also a strategic partner with Take Back the Land. The other thing that we hope that this direct action or this model of organizing creates is alternative structures. So as we talk about community and control of land, what does that look like, right? We feel at Take Back the Land that housing and land as a market commodity, again, doesn't work for poor people. We have to get land and housing off the market. One of the best ways we've seen, the best models of creating that type of a model, is community land trust. Take Back the Land engages in that type of action where we want to direct banks as we create direct action. We want the banks to turn over properties to community land trust. Our most successful case of getting to that point was in Rochester, New York. We engaged in a 2-year battle against Bank of America and engaged in a very public campaign. Many of you know the history of the Catherine Lennon case. We weren't successful at getting Catherine's house turned over to a land trust. We were successful at bringing this issue to the forefront. Catherine is now living in her house in a renegotiated deal that benefits Catherine. It's not the way we want it to end, but what we learned from that is our model is not strong enough, right? So you have to, sometimes you have to step back, self-evaluate, and look at these models that you created. It may not necessarily be foolproof, right? So we have some work to do. We realize that at Take Back the Land. But we also realize that this model engaged people in dialogue and engaged grassroots movement to get up and start to demand that this particular change. We do have a situation now where the housing movement in this country is fractured. And by that I mean there are 2 roads that this housing movement, Take Back the Land, advocates for community control over land and community land trust. There is another road where people are going for principal reduction. While principal reduction brings immediate relief to people, it doesn't build a movement. It doesn't build a sustainable movement. And I'll say that, and I'm going to challenge us as a people. Take Back the Land asserts that we have become self-centered. We have a value about me in this country, right? So if I get my principal reduction, I'm good to go. Have a nice day. I don't need to be involved in a social justice movement. And it's not going to change anything at the end of the day. You may have gotten some immediate relief. You're happy and you go home. But we haven't built any stronger of a movement. Some people got some immediate relief. They rode off into the sunset, and that's it. So how does that create something that community is engaged in? We asserted Take Back the Land that if you have community fighting for community control of land and community control of the land, then we're all invested in this fight. It's different, right? It's not self-centered. We bought into the American dream in this country, and I think that is what's created the self-centered values that we have and we walk around with. And it's a bit of a challenge. How do you change that? Again, getting back into a human rights frame starts to make us look at those values because human rights makes you organize around principles, right? So things like transparency of government, accountability, equity, what is equitable for us, what's universal, what works for all of us. It's a different way of thinking. The other part of this model is collaboration and facilitation. As we put our theories into practice and create these types of models and these PowerPoints, what we create, we call open source. We want to share with the movement. We don't believe that Take Back the Land alone is going to change anything in this country. We believe that we're creating a model that if this model were to grow and expand, then we have a dynamic for change in this particular country. But it's going to take us working together. The other part is support services, and by that I mean we have to build capacity for these local action groups, as we call them, these grassroots organizations doing work around the country, right? There are things like people taking risks. So as they go into a foreclosed home, people stand facing arrest, right? Realistically, you know, what does it look like at the end of the day when Take Back the Land says you need to break in this house and you need to move a family in? Well, what are we subjecting people to when we say that? I know what it looks like here in New York City. You know, we might know what it looks like in Miami, where Max, my partner, was based at one time. We know what it looks like in Washington, D.C. But when I'm on the phone encouraging somebody in Des Moines, Iowa, this is what you need to do, then what am I exposing them to? So it is up to us as a movement to bring resources to some of those groups on the ground. We do that. Take Back the Land has an association with a 501(c) called Movement Catalyst that brings in what we call movement support, training, and other resources, legal resources, to help build a strong movement. You've heard me outline many of these partners. The support services also comes from the U.S. Human Rights Network, and the Center for Constitutional Rights is our legal advocate. Training, we work again with Movement Catalyst to do training in human rights areas, the positive action and organizing models. We do campaign development with the local action groups, develop campaign strategy, ARC and execution, and we work with our strategic partners for direct support. So one of the things I've been challenged to do within Take Back the Land, my particular role as a member of the leadership committee, is to engage the legal community. We feel that the Lawyers Guild in this country stepped up to the sexy movement. When the occupiers walked over the bridge, the National Lawyers Guild went out to defend all of those folks. But poor people and communities of color have been asking the Lawyers Guild for help for years, right? They have the infrastructure that's set up all around the country. And the back was constantly turned, right? There was no response. So it was up to us as leaders in this type of work to challenge the National Lawyers Guild. I can stand here and say that the New York chapter has stepped up and they're starting to engage us in dialogue, and we're starting to branch out and building that infrastructure to support the movement, because there are two tracks when people are engaged in this work, right? There's a criminal case and there's a case in civil court, and those two cases go down somewhat of a same track, but at some point they break off, but those folks need to have that legal support as they go through this process. Communication is the other big part of this, and that's media cultivation and media development. Take Back the Land has a strong association with progressive media outlets like Al Jazeera English, Democracy Now!, MSNBC. So a lot of times these folks are called, and one of the ways, rather than put Max and I on the show, you need to go up to Take Back the Land Rochester, or you need to visit Take Back the Land Madison. You know, strengthen those movements in those particular cities. This is the particular house, Catherine Lennon, that I talked a little bit about. It is a proud moment for Take Back the Land and me personally, because when she was evicted from that house, that was the first time that I felt like it hit home. It touched me, it touched a nerve. And when Catherine said she wanted to move back in that house, she was moved out April 11th, 2011. She was physically removed from the house with the SWAT team in the city of Rochester. We made it clear to that city that anytime you do an eviction from this point on, it's going to require a SWAT team. And if you think that is financially feasible, try us. So on Mother's Day of 2011, we moved Catherine Lennon in a very public move-in back in that particular space. And as I opened up with, Catherine Lennon is safely in that home right now and will remain for the foreseeable future. I wanna close out with a quote and a couple of questions. And this quote is from the man himself, the man of the hour, Mr. David Harvey, who has, helped me, as I said, create a lot of my thinking. And this quote says, "The right to the city is far more than an individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is, moreover, a common rather than an individual right, since transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of collective power to reshape the process of urbanization. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves, I want to agree, is one of the most precious yet neglected of our human rights." And as I opened up with, human rights is at the core of this struggle. I want to thank you, David, for that quote, because I kept reading it over and over, and I said, you know what? Yeah, this is about human rights. So I'm gonna come up with 3 questions that I hope engages the audience in some dialogue after we're all done speaking. And in reality, today, one of the many differences of the groups of people of struggle within separate nonprofit organizations under distinct umbrellas, our struggles are fundamentally interconnected, but we do tend to organize in silos, as I said earlier. Not only do we overlap in tactics and strategies, but also in the root causes of oppression and injury. However, as the fractural state of our struggle today will tell the story we've consistently been divided and conquered throughout history by powerful forces of the other side, of opposition that have successfully pitted us against one another. What can we learn from this past, and what can any one person, group, or groups of groups do to help build and maintain a new kind of far-reaching and inclusive unity that is capable of seeing through the realization of what has yet to be achieved, the universal realization of our human rights? So that's something I would like us to think about. The other question I want to bring to sort of get at us a little bit into our hearts: are we a self-centered movement where we have bought into the American dream, thus rendering any attempts to build a movement ineffective? Something to think about, right? And then I will challenge not only this audience, but Take Back the Land with this assertion. If community land trust is the model, why aren't there more of them, right? So with that, I'm going to close out, and I want to thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, next is Kesembe Balagun. He's a writer, culture activist who served as an outreach coordinator for the Brecht Forum at New York Marxist School. Kesembe, you're going to stay here. You're going to sit down, or you're going to go over there?
Should I sit or should I go?
It's your choice.
I'll stand.
And he said he was going to dance at the end. Pole dance. They were going to dance.
Go Kazembe.
Thank you so much, and thank you, brothers and sisters, for being here. Definitely a shout out to all the people who've organized us here today. The Center for Place Culture and Center for Place, the center here. I'm sorry, and acronyms I always get wrong. The Brecht Forum and obviously Growing Roots and the Urban Ecology Program at the New School. My name is Kazemi Balagun. I am the outreach coordinator at the Brecht Forum. For those of you who don't know, and what I've been asked to do is to address the question of how to organize a city within the context of my work at the Brecht Forum. So I think there's a very important to first situate the Brecht Forum and then kind of pull outward a little bit. So for those of you who don't know, the Brecht Forum is a radical cultural space. We're located in the West Village, quite literally on the West Side Highway on Bank Street. In the Right to the City narratives is very important for us because we're located in the former Bell Laboratories on West Street, Bell Telephone Laboratory. So, the repositioning and repurposing of industry for human good. In fact, the organization that we rent from, Westbeth, as in west of Bethune, is the largest and only artist cooperative housing in New York City. So there's a connection there in terms of the tradition of the West Village and the production of artistic values, both as in terms of a living space, but also in terms of a creative space as well, right in Manhattan. The Brecht Forum that was founded in 1975 is a forum and a gathering place for radicals, progressives, artists, activists, academics to meet, debate, and come, meet, and leave to energize and organize their communities. We're an independent space, meaning that 95% of our funding comes from what we get at the door and fundraising, and we rely on hundreds of volunteers and a small full-time staff. This approach flows from our politics, which is radically anti-capitalist, taking on Marx's vision of communism, each according to their ability, to each according to their need. We act as a school insofar as the movement demands its intellectual arms, its think tanks, its action tanks, like our sister organizations, the Labor Community Strategy Center, 16 Beaver, or Trade School. This goes back to our own lineage this goes back to even more of going back to the radical lineage of literacy projects built upon the traditions of the Highlander School, Septima Clark's voting literacy projects on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and the Freedom Schools in Mississippi. These spaces allow for learner-centered environments, which called for a reading that acted upon the world in the world, as in Paulo Freire. Similar to Marx and Engels' demand that philosophy not only interpret the world, but to change it. These challenges are not only poised at radical reproduction of social life, but also questions of class, and the level in which the intellectual reproduction takes place on a class level. Indeed, one only has to look at the front of the American Museum of Natural History, with the front with our dear President Theodore Roosevelt, horseback, juxtaposed with a black Native American at his side, with the notions of intellectual reproductions has always been also framed within colonial and imperial projects of the 19th and 20th century. This is also a case for most cultural spaces that in the city as well. Many of our museums have taken on this question as well in terms of the class position. So in many ways, what we're talking about is culture. Culture not solely as entertainment, but sustenance. And we remind ourselves that culture is coming from the word koter, the blade undergirding the plow, right? So there's a connection between, the need to eat and the need to having culture. Case in point, looking at this question of culture and class, I can only look as far back in my window at the Brecht Forum, where we see class of culture at play, specifically around the issue of reproduction. Indeed, the renegade tradition of balls, queer peers, is illustrated by the films such as Paris is Burning, and going further back to the activism of Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and many other radical drag queens and transgender activists that led the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969, gave way, in some instances, to Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City. Indeed, the move towards single-room occupancy in same-gender hostels to one-bedroom apartments has posed a critical challenge of private space as public space, or the challenge of whether the political is personal. Indeed, one can play at being in Sex and the City. I'm thinking we're all familiar with the TV show Sex and the City, which is an HBO show that deals with the goings-on of very rich white women and their lovers, and you really have to be there. Indeed, one can play at being Sex in the City with the numerous real estate ads catering to single white existence in the city. If you can't afford single white existence in the city, all at the cheap prices of $500,000 to millions of dollars for a one-bedroom apartment in the West Village of Manhattan. If you cannot afford that amount, that you can't afford millions of dollars, you can spend thousands or hundreds in the Sex and the City tours. For a small amount, you too can take a bus ride tour of the West Village, ending at, what's the name of that place with the cupcakes? Magnolia's. Often at this time, when they are giving out the cupcakes, I present my fat, black, queer body in Adrian Piper fashion in the intervention. Give me a cupcake. But beyond this individual redistribution of wealth, one critically questions sustainability in our world city. In a 4-block area between 13th Street and Bank and Bleecker, one is overrun with chocolate, coffee, wine, and sugar, bringing into focus the cosmopolitan taste of this metropole. It is in that same radius there are no hospitals or public clinics. I often fantasize a scenario with a person on Bain Street calling 911, and the operator suggesting very quietly that they drink a glass of Merlot. I'm here all week, folks. The other side of the city is the city of hope. Certainly the work of Occupy Wall Street and going into Occupy Sandy and this work of our sisters and brothers at Picture the Homeless, Organizing for Occupation, Nesri, Right to the City, etc., is about creating physical space in an open city. This openness allows for creating a spaces of nurturing and feeding, specifically in a time when our young and old people lack physical and cultural moorings. One of the most amazing things I saw at Occupy Wall Street was the People's Library. Like the Afro-Puerto Rican scholar Arturo Schomburg, the understanding of the physical book as an indicator of space and place, but the literacy as the act of sharing, that we're moving towards a shared culture. In thinking about organizing the city, people's culture has to be at the forefront. We cannot imagine the resurgent politics of Weimar Berlin separated from the cabarets of Brecht, the art of Annette Stiegel, or the Red Wedding District. You cannot separate the communist politics in this country of the 1920s and 1930s without discussing the Harlem Renaissance of Langston Hughes, Nella Larson, Zell Neale Hurston, or Claude McKay. And one thing I like to say is that the Harlem Renaissance was purple. It was red and black, and purple is gay. So. Or Sophie Town without Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, or Dollar Brand. In many ways, these movements are illusionary, fleeting, but they are real. There are spheres of actual working class power that reimagine space. Indeed, our challenge is to move from movement spaces to movement communities, to the revolutionary rebel cities of our dreams.
Thanks, Kasamba. Right on time. Yes, absolutely. Well, our next speaker, she will stay here. Uju Agarwal. She's a PhD student here at the Grad Center, also co-founder of the Center for Immigrant Families. And the focus of her research grows out of the organizing work with the Center for Immigrant Families, a social justice organization that, of course, I mentioned that you co-founded. So please, Uju.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about education and the city. And as Miguel said, my talk will focus on some of the work we did at CIF and some of the stuff I'm doing here at the CUNY Grad Center through my research. But thank you also to all the organizers of tonight's conference. It's really awesome to be here. So every May, as the occasion of the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education approaches, newspapers flood with news reports about how segregated and unequal our schools continue to be. And every day, low-income parents, mainly mothers, put in hours of work to advocate for their children through trying to secure good educations for them. Some are successful, and some are criminalized and prosecuted, as we saw, for example, in the cases of Kelly Williams-Bollar and Tanya McDowell, the two black mothers who were arrested last year for using a friend or family member's address to register their children in what they believed to be good schools. Or in the case of the Harlem Nine, a group of mothers who in 1958 were arrested for not sending their children to what they were clear were inferior schools. These mothers were trying to lay claim to their children's right to grow and flourish and learn, their right to be human, and their right to life. And deeply embedded within the stories of these mothers is what Stuart Hall termed a fatal coupling of difference and power, along with love, as they attempted to fasten the futures of their children. And while all futures are, of course, contingent, some are less secured. A recent study from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation affirmed what many have known to be true for a very long time, that premature death is significantly determined by access to education, which is stratified by race and class. These findings also verify Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. In such a formulation, education becomes representative of life, while unequal or segregated education becomes representative of differentially valued life. In education organizing, this is too often what we lose sight of as we attempt to organize for non-reformist reforms that might create greater power and leverage for our communities. But if we look back just a little bit in history, there are many examples we can draw from, and one is a movement for community control of schools. One thing that made this movement unique and successful is that it was rooted in local visions that were networked together and brought to scale. Different from being thrown into a melting pot of multicultural American dreams, these visions remain distinct, meaning that for some communities, language rights were vital, while for other communities, the pedagogical recovery of their history was critical. But while the visions that grounded this movement remained distinct, the communities that they came from were able to unite with common clarity that their public schools should be democratically run institutions that reflected, served, and respected the communities that they were part of. And what was able to then galvanize working class parents of color to keep their children home from school and create and model the alternative practices that they were calling for the state to adopt was not only a uniform rallying cry or a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather was local visions of change born out of the shared lived conditions by families in distinct areas of the city. I was part of an organization here in New York City that tried to build on this legacy. The Center for Immigrant Families was an organization that was founded in the wake of 3 pretty horrible federal pieces of legislation passed in 1996 under the Clinton administration. Together, the welfare and immigration laws and the Effective Death Penalty and Anti-Terrorism Act clamped down on poor and working class communities, particularly communities of color. And low-income immigrant women of color were particular protagonists in the dominant logic of reform. While lots of important efforts sought to challenge the constitutionality of these laws or aspects of them, in many ways, the dominant logic, which implied that poor and working class immigrant women of color were problems to be fixed, and that if we were just tweaked a little bit here or there, if we just learned English, if we were better mothers, if we made better decisions, then things might be okay. This logic remained intact within many of the reforms that were tried. But this never seemed to work, and we remained as we were, outsiders who were to blame for problems that range from broken health and education systems to the loss of jobs and falling wages. So at CIF, we believed it was critical for us to begin from another place with our stories of migration that were more than when we or families came here. But they were also stories of survival, they were stories of loss, they were stories of harm, and there were also stories of joy. Based on popular education, our stories became central to the deep community we built, to our organizing, and to our vision for change. And as we shared our stories of why we and our families came here, of what we expected and what we found, we identified a common thread throughout our different experiences, a thread that centered around education, the hope for it, and the realities that we faced in our local schools. Before I continue, a quick piece of background. The neighborhood that we organized in is called Manhattan Valley, and it's part of New York City's Community School District 3, which goes from 57th Street to 122nd Street along the west side of Manhattan. District 3 is about the size of a lot of school districts across the country, and in District 3, the public school population is comprised of about 3/4 low-income and students of color. It's also the most racial and economically diverse district in the city, and yet also the most segregated and unequal. So as we've started delving more into the theme of education that we identified, more and more members started sharing stories of being shut out of schools that they themselves had attended, being told that a particular school was not for them, being told that another school would speak their language. Some recounted that the school took photographs of themselves and their children when they tried to register their children at school. Others were told that they couldn't sit by their children, as other mothers did, as they ate breakfast, because too many mothers of children who received free breakfast were supposedly eating their children's food. Still others shared stories of their children being asked by school officials to verify where they slept at night, and of home visits made by school social workers that were meant to confirm a family's residence, visits that members were certain were not random. So we realized 2 things. We realized, one, that our problems were not new, and that we also needed to talk to more parents. Together, we learned about the history of segregated education in this country and the movements that rose up to challenge it. We also started doing outreach in the community and talk to others to find out if others were experiencing the same thing. Our goal was to understand how segregated education was occurring and how it was really structured in our district half a century after Brown versus Board of Education. And so we started with surveys, and we developed them collectively. We thought we had really good questions. We went out in teams before and after school, during weekends, at laundromats, playgrounds, and supermarkets. But after a while of trying this, we realized we needed to change something because nobody was talking to us, or they weren't talking enough. While our surveys made sense to us and began with a few simple questions like, have you experienced discrimination in your school? Have you had a problem in your school or applying to when you tried to apply to a school for your child? We weren't getting many responses. And part of the problem was that nobody wanted a problem, so why would you really say that you had one when you were asked that you had one? But more so, we realized that we needed to begin a few steps back and shift how segregated and unequal education had become normalized and how injustice in education didn't really stand out from injustice in other parts of people's lives. So we asked allies to train us on theater of the oppressed, and from our own stories, we developed composite stories that portrayed members' realities. We performed these skits in school cafeterias across our community, and something started to shift. Witnessing members' stories that resonated with their own experiences encouraged other parents to share their own, thus affirming Leslie Marmon Silko's observant warning that stories aren't just entertainment. We started documenting and ended up documenting over 300 stories, and from these stories identified what we called mechanisms of exclusion that kept low-income families relegated to certain schools. Throughout our organizing, member stories and leadership was at the forefront, but instead of a one-time and discrete act, these stories highlighted our unity and difference and also helped build one of our greatest strengths, a strong and visible community where parents and caretakers weren't just concerned about their own child, but rather were fighting for what they understood to be their shared collective future. In response to the increased visibility we were able to bring to the segregated realities of our schools, a special meeting was called by the local school district and the city's Department of Education to discuss a uniform admissions policy. The meeting was held on a spring evening at PS 75. This was in 2005, and PS 75 is a public elementary school that's located on 96th Street, which had historically been a dividing line between the uptown and downtown schools in the district. The school auditorium was packed, and then New York City Public Schools Chancellor Joel Klein was in attendance. Sections of the auditorium were taken up by parents, mostly mothers, and some schools sat together with each other in blocks. Rows of black and brown parents were countered by rows filled with mostly all white parents. Anger and irritation grew, increasingly palpable as Klein announced that the system was, quote, inequitable and needed to be changed. One mother who got up to speak that evening was visibly pregnant. She declared that she had recently bought a condo in the neighborhood and that the local district policies were not going to determine the fate of her unborn child, nor deny her the right to choose what was best for her child. Like others she sat to, she had identified the need to make sure that her rights and those of her unborn child would be protected. In some ways, this mother was just like her black and brown counterparts sitting in other sections of the auditorium. They all wanted the very best for their child, and they all seemed to take very seriously their roles, 5 minutes, okay, as mothers in supporting their children. Yet for this mother, rights were predicated on access to her child being secured through her recent housing purchase, and this was different from CIF members and supporters in the auditorium who came with each other, their stories, and a row full of placards. Soon after Klein made his public admission of systemic guilt, the DOE proposed a policy change for a uniform admissions policy for out-of-zone seats, which at the time accounted for 50% of incoming kindergarten seats, and which until then had been left to the discretion of school administrators to assign. It's years later now, and the policy for uniform admissions has been done and undone, but that's not the point that I wanted to share tonight. What I do want to highlight is the way in our organizing in the context of District 3 that it's not only about protecting the public or claiming rights. In District 3, there is in fact a very strong movement against charter schools, which have been growing steadily, and a strong pro-public stance. But this stance is taken from the very same parents who are trying to protect the structures of segregation from which they benefit. As one parent I interviewed put it, the problem of District 3 is a problem of, quote, progressives with limits. In his book, Amazing Grace, education scholar and activist Jonathan Kozol also notes that the Upper West Side, where civic responsibility and the notion of the public are revered, is a site filled with the contradictions of liberalism when it comes to citizenship in public schools. And the notion of limits comes up when when addressing the question of how the resources of the public might be distributed. In the last years, the contradictions of liberalism and their accompanying strategies of exclusion have grown even more pronounced. In the wake of the financial crisis, there's been an inpouring of families to the public school system who would have otherwise opted for private schools. In District 3, this meant that between 2009 and 2010, the kindergarten population rose by about 200 students. But it hasn't just been a bulge in numbers that has characterized these years. While greater investment in public schools may sound like a desirable scenario, it also exacerbated a problem. The would-be private school parents were not looking for just any public school. They were looking for excellent public schools for their children that would justify the shift from public to private, from private to public. They define quality in particular ways, and because of the flexible choice programs of District 3, where schools themselves get to determine their own criteria for admissions, the schools were able to accommodate the desires of what one member calls the movers and shakers, or the new families who enter the public system and who bring with them a lot of money and political power. What this has meant is that at some schools, because of preferences given to white and middle-class families, the brand of parental involvement that they bring, these schools have transformed within a period of a few years from being places that were indicative of what Ruthie Gilmore has called the forgotten or abandoned places of the racial state to being places that have come to be fought over as the new families entering the public system claim their own right to the city and their own right to the public. District 3 is in many ways a microcosm, and the public school switch is a citywide phenomenon, one that's occurring in many neighborhoods and other districts right now, particularly ones that share characteristics of Manhattan Valley in terms of being stalled in their gentrification processes to some degrees. And so within these gentrifying and mixed income school districts like District 3, the new contestations taking place over once forgotten public schools also shape how we understand community and claims to urban space. One last kind of quick reflection to close. So while our visions need to be very locally rooted and clear about who and who's making claims to the public and what types of claims we are attempting to defend. We also have to be able to have really broad and wide and expansive visions and see the forest for the trees. Back in 2009, when mayoral control was up for renewal here in New York City, we were not able to do this as a movement. Most everyone believed that Bloomberg's centralized control of schools had done and would continue to do damage, and it has. But at the time, our left here in New York City was indicative of at least two symptoms of what has come to be called the not-for-profit industrial complex. The first had to do with silo-based organizing, which you mentioned, and the second has to do with the question of political purpose and what has come to be called winnable versus what might be, and in our inability to bring the two together. So on one side, we had those who wanted at all costs to be present at the negotiating table and advocating some tweaking of what was, and on the other, we had those who wanted a whole new system, but who were lacking in the tilled ground to get there. Mostly what we lacked was a capacity for sight, to be able to see ourselves as a movement broad and wide and capable. The right, speaking broadly, has done this. They've been able to tap into the frustrations of families with the public education system, but they don't own our stories of generational abandonment. We do, and they are our own. And as we saw with Occupy, placed alongside each other, these stories of schools as places in a community that are in fact more than buildings, but rather spaces which, amidst a changing urban landscape, hold the intergenerational histories that we share and the daily acts of growing up, of working, of raising children. These stories can be very powerful, and they can also ground our vision and organizing for our right to a just city. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Our last panelist, and I hope that you still have some energy there because a lot of things have been picked up. It could be, it proves to be a very nice conversation at the end. It's Tammy Bang Liu. She's Associate Director of the Labor and Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles, multiracial anti-corporate think tank, ACT Tank, a national school for organizers committed to building democratic international social movements. She's also serving as a coordinating committee for the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance.
Okay.
Thank you, Tammy.
How are folks doing tonight? Good. Yeah? We still got an hour, right, for a conversation. So there's already been a lot of things that's been added to this conversation, so I'll just throw out a couple more things. How many folks have heard of the Bus Riders Union? Okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit, then I'll try to hit on more than some points to add to the conversation versus then I don't have to necessarily go through the background. Again, the Labor Community Strategy Center is a think tank, ACT Tank. So we've built the Bus Riders Union that's really thinking about mass transportation, not just as a mobility, a civil rights, but also a question in terms of really addressing climate. Right? And we also have the Community Rights Campaign, which is organizing in the schools to take on the school-to-prison pipeline as a form of mass incarceration as it looks like today. Right? So I think what I want to start with is first why we chose the Bus Riders Union. If we're thinking about organizing a city, right? To us, I think we need to understand a lot. I think people have talked about the conjuncture, a lot of this. To us, a lot of the disinvestment, the securitization, the forms of ways in which racism happens, the facilitation of the use of the state for capital funds, that is the logic of imperialism. Right? It is our economic system. So that's like a connected system. So we see transportation as one important site of struggle. It's not the end all to be all, but it is one that makes important links. So if you've been to Los Angeles, you understand that Los Angeles County has 4,000 square miles, 10 million people. The folks who depend on public transportation are 90% Black, Latino, and Asian. They make less than $20,000 a year in a family income, in which the median income of the county is $54,000. So we're talking about the working class, and extremely poor. We're talking low wage, no wage, informal sector, you name it. People going in and out of prison, that's who's on the bus. So to us, transportation and the bus is an important site of struggle. If you were in Los Angeles, it's still very segregated housing-wise. So if you're doing traditional quote-unquote community organizing, maybe Black and Latino, right? It's really difficult to have a multiracial experiment. So to us, the bus as a site of organizing is important because you're here, you've got someone from Korea who's speaking Korean, someone from Watts who can tell you, they've been in the Black Panther Party. Actually, a lot of people have been in the Black Panther Party who I've met on the bus. And if that many people were in the Black Panther Party, I'd like to imagine what we really could have done. But we do have that many people in the Black Panther Party, right? Or somebody from Guatemala or Mexicanos, or if you're in San Gabriel Valley, you're talking about, ethnic Chinese from Vietnam or Chinese from Fujian, you name it. It's really diverse. Right? And so to us, building a bus riders union, so it's not the point of production, but it is a site of organizing working class people of color. Right? So to us, the class question is a very racial question, right? I mean, you can call it class-based racism or race-based poverty, but the reality is they're linked. And we're talking about the feminization of poverty, right? So this is an important to us, a site of struggle. So when we're building a bus riders union, we want to experiment on what it means to build a multiracial form, to really see if we can grapple with the contradictions that are not attacking, but they're amongst the people, right? So if you come to, Korean family and talk about, hey, what's going on? How do you feel about what's going on the bus? And they'll be like, well, it's all those Latino and all the kids, or it's the bus driver. So it's like, how do we actually challenge bus riders to see their experience in a systemic manner? Right? So to draw the larger systemic implications of what's going on and what they see in terms of the use of, the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, is a $4 billion institution, right? Their use is supposed to be public transportation. But as we've seen in terms of different tax measures, they're using that money more to facilitate capital flows, right? We just had a Measure J on the ballot, which was trying to get $90 billion more in the span of some years as a regressive taxation so that MTA could build more rail lines. But who was giving money for that? It was Westfield Company, right? Because they wanted a rail line to go through their mall. Or it's AEG because they want people to go downtown so that you can go to the new, I don't know, football stadium if they can get it, right? And NBC Universal so that you can ride out to the Universal City. So transportation not as a site of mobility, but as a way to actually facilitate the use of public funds, not necessarily for common good, but more like facilitation of capital projects. It's boondoggle. In Los Angeles, mass transportation is boondoggle. You're building rail lines because they feel like the rail lines will get you construction dollars. They can leverage development. But as we've seen in different studies, and they're not left studies, this is like the Dukakis Center, right? I mean, they're saying that what they're seeing is the more rail you see that's built, you see gentrification and displacement, and actually transit ridership go down. Because who they're attracting onto these sites are not folks that use public transportation, but they're trying to attract choice riders to come back and live back in the city, right? And what you're seeing is these riders are more affluent, they're preferring to drive cars, so the facilitation of what we're seeing transit-oriented development, a lot of this ways in which they're reimagining the city, but for whom? So essentially what we're doing is we're fighting for the soul of the city. So to us, the bus riders union is transportation as an important way in which in Los Angeles, if you want to talk about capital, you want to talk about land. And transportation is an important site. You're talking about a public space to organize a multiracial experiment, right? And we're talking about ways in which we're seeing forms of the state being used, not in the benefit of the common good. But it's a questionable thing, right? Because everybody's really now, if you're looking at urban development, people are talking about smart growth. Well, Pete said, well, Safer Cities Initiative, safer for whom? Well, smart growth for whom? You want to build these livable cities where folks can live there, work there, have shops, cultural events. I mean, those are a great way to reimagine a city, but for whom does it belong, right? And if we're looking at massive public investment, who are we willing to make massive public investments for? That's why the bus riders union comes in. To us, it's about organizing the 500,000 people who depend on public transportation to reimagine the city and force the actual investment for their ability to get to jobs, schools, and healthcare centers. It's to build a multiracial experiment. Yes, it's fighting for a thing, which is thinking about mass transportation as a human right. But in the course of it, we're trying to build a mass organization on wheels that looks beyond just transportation and making the connections between what impacts their lives, immigration, the war state, right? So I really want to talk about, like, in the sense of if we're thinking about how are we reimagining the city, we need to think about for whom, right? That then puts us up against, who's running the city, who's running the state, and oftentimes it's up against Democrats. So you have, on the one hand, if you look at Measure J that we're talking about, or the different facilities of who's making the decisions, you'll have the Democratic Party, which is supposed to be a liberal party, right? Up against organized labor, because they want construction jobs, which is not a bad thing, but they're short-term construction jobs. So essentially, oftentimes what you're doing is pitting one form of labor against another form of labor, right? You want well-paying, short-term construction jobs, right? Shovel-ready jobs, up against domestic workers, hotel and restaurant employees, security guards, low, no-wage workers, right? So we've got to really think about, when we're thinking about massive public investment, for whom is it going to be benefiting? And how are we actually going to have a conversation inside the movement about preserving that right? And I think it's complicated. Right? So oftentimes, the bus riders union, it's like we're seeing, it's a little bit narrow. Why are you guys always fighting about buses? Or we get the opposite thing of, we like that you guys are talking about buses, but why do you guys talk about race all the time, right? So you don't win, either way you go. But I do think that if we're building, so for us in Los Angeles, The site of struggle is important, trying to understand what the issue is, because we think transportation is an important locus of where capital travels in terms of development, right? We think bus riders and the working class, not necessarily at the point of production, but in who they are, is an important social, in terms of building the social capacity of who's going to be able to fight for transformation in a city. Right? I do think for us, the form of organizing, we call it transformative organizing. In some ways, we're trying to transform the system in which we're fighting. We're trying to transform the ways in which we relate together as a political process of kind of organizations we're trying to build together. So yes, experimenting with what democracy means, of collective decision-making. I think those are important forms of trying to think about what it means to have a unity and struggle in terms of the contradictions that exist inside our communities. And it's about really thinking about ways to build independent organizations that are able to be independent of the Democrats and independent of the labor movement, while looking for ways to unite when we can. And trying to think about ways to build fronts of struggle that could be collective and shared, but around a real basis of how we're going to fight for the soul of the city. So around program, right? We're looking for ways to unite around program. I do think that, a lot of the discourse has been about how do we facilitate moving the middle class, right? I have not heard the working class in a very long time. In the sense of where is the class struggle element. I mean, I'm hearing it obviously in this context, but in even the movement, a lot of folks are talking about, we need middle class jobs, middle class, right? And I think that needs to be challenged in many ways. Because what that assumes is if you see a trend, it's for which communities are we willing to give up. So we are not criminals. It means you can go ahead and criminalize that that portion of the community is okay to build prisons, to not let them have education, et cetera. Like, they're okay, but not us. Like, so we're okay, we want to fight for middle class jobs, but let's forget about the low, no wage worker, right? The precarious worker, the folks who are juggling multiple niche jobs, right? And it has a conversation around who are we fighting for? So I do think that when we're thinking about a city, it's really important about who are we trying to organize and who's most impacted, and are they part of the conversation and the movement? I do think, important, I really think we need to challenge community organizing, to talk about whether you call it, conscious organizing, transformative organizing, even the visionary organizing that folks are talking about. But I want to really challenge the notion that we need to move beyond protest. I don't really see it as a dichotomy. I mean, in many ways, we're fighting to, obviously, yes, fight for the resources and make demands on the state. But in the course of struggle, we are trying to think about what it looks like to build new modes of transportation. To us, mass transportation, LA is the auto capital. We like to think of it at least the auto capital of the US, if not the world. Detroit might be really angry. She's not here, Maryland's not here. They may build it, but we drive it. Right? 10 million people, 7.5 million vehicles. We're responsible for 50% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, automobile greenhouse gas emissions, the United States. So I think another portion of thinking about how are we reimagining the city or fighting for the soul of the city or organizing a city, I think the question of climate becomes central. We're not going to be able to maintain the standard of living that exists inside the United States, or in terms of what we're trying to fight for. So your question around the American dream, it can't exist, right? Because even if we were to socialize here in the United States, we're socializing essentially the spoils of US imperialism, the spoils of empire. So we've got to really reimagine what that looks like. And to us, transportation is forcing a question around the automobile. So we've been able to win $2.7 billion that's gone reinvested back into mass transit mobility for the bus system, right? That's forcing a question around the automobile. And to us, if we can make a dent, it's talking about a structural space. There's 650 square miles of freeway throughout the whole county. To make sure that that's not used for single passenger automobiles, but used for mass transportation. So it's a collective mode of transportation. Is it a revolution? No. Is it a revolutionary advance? Could be. It could be a real thing about thinking about how we reimagine how we're going to structure these cities and what is possible. What is the standard of living? What does smart growth look like? And we've got to think about it not just in the context of who the community is, but we've got to think about the community in a broader global sense, because we're not going to be able to imagine a city, or there's no re-going back to something, right? Not that I even agreed with what that was. But there needs to be a thinking about what it needs to be, and I think the climate question needs to be central, particularly when we're talking about inside a city. So, I think, so to us, the other thing is transportation. I do think it's important to think about, I think, redistribution of wealth, right? The expansion of democratic rights, even as false it may be, we're trying to push that bound. To us, the question around a social wage is really important. We can fight for, a living wage, so you get $14, $18, but if that's going to go out the door because we got to pay for insurance or, privatization of education or the lack of transportation, what is that going to mean in terms of the end of the day, in terms of people's condition, right, of life, even though we need to reimagine what that could look like. So anyways, those are things I'll throw in for the conversation.
Yes, it was a good panel. The 15 minutes each, it's really good. No, I think many questions, of course, arise out of these 4 presentations, and I always like to pose in here so that you guys pose more sort of deep questions. I mean, the most sort of naive of questions for the 4 panelists. I mean, one thing that I listened to was 4 different forms of modes of organizing. I mean, let's not say modes of organizing, but focuses of organizing. On one hand, we have cultural production, cultural platforms. We have the issue of education, have the issue of transport and housing. Now, the naive question comes here. Can I ask each of the panelists to imagine just for, or perhaps you have already done it, so it will totally cancel, just to explain a little bit more, to imagine what would your organization be like in the case of Kazembe if you introduced or collaborated or whatever with housing, education, and transportation. In your case with transportation, cultural platforms, and housing. And in your case with housing, which is also quite an issue in Los Angeles, there's no question about it, as a cultural platform and education, and and the like. And perhaps you can sort of entice us with your imagination. How would it look like? And for 5 minutes each of you, and then that's it. I will just open it up because I'm sure that there's a lot of questions here. One of the things that we intended somehow in the co-organization of this, and my little part that I took in it, is I listened a lot, the desire or the need of this event to push the boundaries of that sort of silo structure. Not that any of you does not claim at this, right? To see how we can look at the ecological or the dynamic totality of the urban system and begin to organize in many different fronts. So that's why I asked this question, and please, Kazembe, in that order.
Oh, okay. Well, I think certainly when we're thinking about social space and reproduction, cultural reproduction, that's automatically, in conversation with and added to the questions of housing, questions of education, and the questions of I like what Rob put out, the question of human rights, and what it means to be a human. I think that, what we're looking at right now is looking at the totality of the human being and going beyond a sort of one-dimensionality of someone who's just an economic producer and to really have a real flowering. So when I think about that, I think about it in terms of really, in my imaginary city, that, that all these things are interrelated. And one example I have is obviously the social centers in Europe, where you have block-long social centers that actually run their own alternative daycares, that run their own alternative gardens, that run their own alternative institutions. One of the things that we're seeing right now is that, as the scholar Cedric Robinson notes that, slavery and imperialism came in terms of the relationship with the metropole. So this particular city, when they occupied Wall Street, that was historically correct. Because what was Wall Street? Wall Street was the first commodity sold on Wall Street were black slaves. And the reason they call it Wall Street is because they built a wall to keep the Indians out. Since that time, from that point onwards, in the 1600s to now, Wall Street has been the center of everything that the city has been about, right? And what we're witnessing in relationship to, in terms of the protest movement, and the protest in terms of really challenging political power, is the need to unloosen that control in which Wall Street has. So that means that we have to have on-the-block neighborhoods that are strong, that are self-determining, but also recast what it means in terms of what it means to be in a city. And I think part of that is using both in terms of housing, housing work, these cultural forms, and also bringing it forward. One thing for me is that I think that we don't really, particularly in New York City, we're not doing this work without a particular history of struggle. I live in Corp City, and that's a neighborhood that was built alongside the Allerton Coops that was founded by communist organizers. Penn South, another organization that was founded by union members that during Hurricane Sandy opened up their doors to people who needed shelter. So when you're thinking about this question of housing, activists saw housing connected to the building of a people's culture, and I think that's the way we have to think about it in the interrelationship in terms of our communities and neighborhoods.
Thanks, Kasemba. Would you, please?
So I'll be real quick. I mean, housing is definitely linked to our struggle around education and confronting what is meant in the context of gentrification. But one of the things that we're doing is, and how it's linked to transportation, I guess, is that, there's two different mindsets, I think, that are being articulated within the struggle that we're facing right now, where middle-class parents say, it's really important that my child go within like 5 or 10 blocks of my school because I can't, walking and young children, they can't be transported for more than that. But then the parents at the Head Start Center and our members say, we'll take a bus, we'll take a train, we'll take wherever, just give our kids a good education. And they are willing to put down the money which for the public transportation cost every day as well. But one of the things we're doing is right now, anticipating an opening with Bloomberg getting out of office, and linking up with other districts that are facing similar conditions to call for a policy of admissions and student assignment that requires all schools to reflect the demographic makeups of the communities that they're in, right? And that so gets rid of zone lines, but also gets rid of them with these controls put in place. And those controls would have to be specific to the communities. So they would require a community coming together and determining what is a difference that makes the most difference in their community in terms of student achievement or outcomes.
Yeah. Well, I think if you center the actual families and the communities that you work with, then the question is, why are there splits? I mean, the same family that's dealing with the need for mass transportation and mobility are actually struggling, and their kids are getting criminalized inside the schools. They're facing foreclosure inside the homes, and I think it makes a natural sense. Pete, who was just here earlier, the bus riders union in LA Can often collaborated. The mayor was trying to put forward, as they were cutting after-school care, library hours, 1,000 more cops. So we would go out every year with a State of the City address, and be like, well, 1,000 more buses, 1,000 less cops, 1,000 more homes, 1,000 less cops, 1,000 more jobs, 1,000 less cops. It made a lot of sense, right? The Take Back the Right to the City folks inside Los Angeles, we've been doing a lot of work around, ELAC, the East Los Angeles Community Corporation, who are a member of Right to the City. They've been dealing with different metro sites that Metro owns a lot of plots of land. Between LA Metro and LAUSD, the school district, there's a lot of land ownership by these entities. And so you're seeing that they're owning land in which these rail construction lines are being built. Well, they're trying to dislocate smaller businesses on behalf of CVS. And so ELAC just won a campaign to stop that displacement of smaller, long-time, Latino-based businesses for CVS, right? And so we've been able to actually, through that work, been linking this whole concept of transit-oriented development that's happening, right? Which is a smart growth term that they use in terms of urban planning, but we've been really tracking the level in which it creates gentrification and displacement. And in that way, we're thinking around ways in which you're trying to think about transit-related development in a way that doesn't displace and gentrify, but actually also brings up transportation use, not its current model. So that there's ways in which I think we need to think about what are common programs that could be put forward on behalf of the very families and communities that we're fighting beyond, and I think that we'll be able to link up a lot of these sets of conversations. I just think that for us, we need to think about what it would take in order to have those kinds of conversations for these shared visions for our community.
Thanks, Tammy. Rob?
So I just agree with everything everybody said, and one of the things I've been saying about the Occupy movement is those spaces that Tammy is talking about. Education is at the crux of building these stronger communities, interconnecting our fights, right? So the Occupy movement can mobilize, community groups can organize, and I constantly say, what a movement we create if those two forces came together, right? So open up that space, and I think education is at the crux of it. The other two members of the leadership committee of Take Back the Land are leaving for South Africa tomorrow, and they will be studying with the Abishali movement, and I think it's incredible to learn from other movements, because everybody talked about the social centers. So I get the pleasure of working with Frank Morales here, who we work together with the European Squatters Collective and learning about those social centers and learning from those movements. And I had a conversation with Miguel earlier about the way other movements work in other areas of the world. And I think there's been somewhat of a reluctance of us in this country to share knowledge, share a knowledge base, and bring our communities together. We have to be intentional about that, right? And that's why I mentioned when we create a PowerPoint, it's open source. If you want it, I'll email it to you tonight. You know what I mean? We need to share our knowledge base. That's how you build a strong movement. And that's how you bring these struggles together and build those strong bases that are needed. So I've been fortunate to learn, and through Take Back the Land, learn with a lot of different communities around the country and around the world. And I think we have to continue to be intentional as organizers of opening up those spaces and get away from that organizing in, again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but we tend to do it organized in silos, and that's the foundation money at the base of that. I would ask this audience, churches don't depend on foundation money, and they've been doing social justice work, right? So maybe we need to change our model.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to open the questions to the audience. There are 2 microphones, one on each, and those of you that have comments, replies, criticisms, etc., are pretty much welcome. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, folks. When I find myself in these spaces, it feels like there's a lot of assumptions being made around what a movement is and what a community is. And so I was wondering if somebody can help me out with what qualifies as a movement.
Who wants to take that one?
I have no idea. No.
And you know what? I think the panel gave you the answer. I don't think we know in this particular country, right? We're struggling to figure that out. I can tell you doing housing work, I know we don't have a housing movement. I know we don't have one, because we're so divided, right? And I think a movement comes with many moving parts, right? It could be It's community organizing, bringing community together to support community. I'm seeing a little bit of that in Sunset Park, right? I've worked with the Sunset Park rent strikers, and these are folks that are undocumented and were afraid, but they're starting to understand that either we have to rise up and fight those powers, or they're going to keep oppressing us. And, you know, most of those folks are undocumented and folks that weren't born and raised here. And I put a lot of energy in it, and this is something, again, and I'm opening up a lot here. I'm critical, right, of the movements in this country, or what we call movements, or whatever it is. But I can tell you that small little close-knit community is rising up and saying, give me the tool, tell me what it is we need to do, we'll do it. But we're not so sure what it is we need to do. So education is at the crux of it, and as you watch these groups, primarily women of color who have been oppressed, right, they're starting to understand and starting to get materials and learn, and then they move into a Felix Ortiz's office and take it over and say, look, you know, this is what's happening in our community. Until you meet with us, we're not leaving your office, right? And, you know, it's a matter of time, right? And you bring folks together and talk about the issues. So, you know, that gets brought out on a grander scale. I'm not describing a movement, but it starts as something small and grows into something big, I can say that.
I think that's. Thank you so much for that very good question. I think that movement is a combination of activism and organizing. I think you need people who are on the ground, who are really exciting a community around a particular vision that gets people to actually move, right? And actually to actually be in spaces of actual movement. And that's what an activist does, right? An organizer creates the resources and the planning in the space where people can actually come to a specific space to do something. Right, so when you're talking about OWS, and this goes back to like space and place, people are like, well, I need to go to the movement, and you say, okay, it's over there, right? This is the Black Panther Party office, Occupy Wall Street, all our various organizations, and then when you get to that movement point, they tell you to go someplace else. Go back to your community and activize it, and really take the leadership of it. And I think it has to be that combination of the two. But I also think that one of the pieces that's really important, I think Tammy brought it up too, is this anti-capitalist piece, right? Because I think that it's really important to really understand that what we're facing in terms of the crisis of the city, and various people at the BRAC, and Brother Max, and Matthew Burkhardt brought this up, is that the crisis of the city is also the crisis of empire, right? Fundamentally. So these are the contradictions that we're facing. And so when people are coming to us for these resources, we're both training them both in terms of the organizing capacity, but also in terms of a sense of our understanding, which is survival, right? In terms of what we want to see a different world will look like. So I think that that's the combination. It's both going to, coming from, but also a different type of vision, and that will constitute a movement. In terms of the question of community, I think community is a very broad term, but I think community is where you're at geographically. But at the same time, I don't think that I think there's oftentimes an assumption around the homogeneity of community, and so it's oftentimes a very problematic term. But I think that there's oftentimes multiple communities at play when we're dealing with it, and I think that's been illustrated by Uju and Tammy as well.
Thank you, Kisembe. We're going to listen to another question. I didn't see who was first, but choose yourself.
My question is getting back. I appreciated the the startup question about how do you think about your particular operation in light of other things happening, or think about it systemically. And I guess I'm looking at tomorrow's event, and everything is in silos. And so I'm trying to create an organization where we're doing more of the European style and trying to integrate all these things, because I spent the last 4 years looking at models where people were trying to operate systemically, and we're just not well practiced in it. We don't really have the right tools, because the work that you guys are doing in the front lines is like, you need all your focus. So I'm really interested in exploring that a little bit more. I think you sort of touched on it a little bit, but I'm just wondering, I guess I'm wondering about this, that everything's isolated, but also if you could just spend a little more time in more detail about how you work with housing and transportation, or integrate maybe urban farming with the education. Like, are any of those things happening within your operations? I don't know.
I just want to take a little bit, not to respond and take the panel's job here, but sometimes we also over-idealize this issue. I mean, I listened to organizing the European style. I lived many years in Europe, and I didn't see that. It is, we take things that we see and we imagine these issues, but the reality is the whole world in the terms of organizing is in huge crisis. I mean, and one of the things that this event is trying to push forward, I believe, is actually the urgent rethinking of what the hell are we doing with these, as you say, in these siloed, positions. What I would hope for that comes out tomorrow is everybody's piece being siloed, because the panels in the afternoon are meant to actually configure a little bit more that organization. But ultimately, I mean, that panel is constructed for those of us that are going to be participating, so we can take the platform and do whatever we need to do in that direction, and probably inciting revolution inside the panel. But,
Right.
but it is very important, that your question, that we continue to ask this, and move forward. And again, with that idealization, I would like to hear which movements in Europe you've seen that do all these sort of things, because I really don't know too many, perhaps one or two that I can think of. Yes. Okay, right.
So, about a year ago, one of the placards that circulated with the Occupy movement was this: the odds are on our side, 99-1. And I think it's really interesting because, I think Occupy stumbled on this 99% versus 1% idea, but it has a lot of resonance and consonance with who actually owns and controls the means of production and the wealth in our society, right? That's the theory under which it came. And really, I feel like during the 20 years in which I've become an activist, the left's position about who is our side and who is like the working class and the revolutionary class has been a much smaller group than 99%. And so when I was listening to the kind of implicit questions or rhetorical questions that were being asked by some of the panelists in terms of like smart growth for who, or other kinds of parents who want the best education for their unborn child, like those people are fundamentally in the 99%. They don't own the means of production. They have major economic, racial, social advantages over some of the people that are on this panel, the groups that some of these people are on this panel are organizing and representing. But I guess what I'm wondering about is like, how does a movement go from being combative, which it needs to be and needs to still continue to be, to also being irresistible, to also bringing those odds on our side, to putting out a vision that says, look, we see all this wealth, it's concentrated here, the capitalist system creates more than enough wealth for everyone to have smart growth for them, for everyone to have the schools that they deserve and the best for their children. So often I feel like those movements and organizations that try and identify themselves as strategically left, because of this tradition that is, I think, very different than the tradition of opposing just those who own the means of production, seem to be looking at a smaller group as if we could win without having that middle sector on our side. And so I'm just wondering, like, is there something else that, like, how do we present those visions? And I'm wondering concretely, like, if Uju, you see ways that like there's a vision that can be presented that will make every middle class parent in New York City want to be on board for reforming education in a way that you would support. And Sun Young, is there a way that you could find, a pattern for growing the transit system in LA that you would want to have a 2/3 vote on? Because I think, those have been very fractious things. Measure J was just a very fractious thing. And I think a lot of people who want to see and want to live in a better city in both of those domains like end up feeling detached and disconnected from these very vital left movement institutions.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. No. I think that, we have definitely always tried to engage allies who, who would be willing to say yes, but what we're also confronting is a reality where at a recent meeting in the district, people say it might be the right thing to do, but how do you sacrifice the academic achievement of your child, right? And so what's implied in there is that if, and the person saying this was one of these middle-class parents, right? So if their child is sacrificed and goes to school with poor children, then they're sacrificing their academic achievement because they're gonna not do as well if they're learning next to poor children. And that is a notion that runs really deep and that people are also not willing to give up. So as we frame our vision broadly and ask people to join us, we're also, I mean, one of the readings I think that people put together for the conference was about the notion of, I think it's Grace Lee Boggs, who says that, you know, the revolution here is going to be the first revolution where people have to actually give up something. And so I mean, we're not asking people to say, you know, so as we frame our vision broadly, we are asking people to join us, and we don't want to keep our base small or our movement tiny, but or necessarily even combative. But given the current conditions that we're in, that is what we face. So, yeah.
So for folks who don't know, Sun Young Yang is the lead organizer of the Bus Riders Union, and so no, totally, because I think folks were like, oh, what's? It's totally okay. Carl, we know each other from a while. So, look, our vision, we have a new vision for urban transportation in Los Angeles, right? We think it actually can benefit the whole, but you first have to accept the vision. So it's not going to be fancy to folks who want their cars. It's not. I mean, it's going to force them to actually think different and value something different. We are trying to put forward something counter-hegemonic. I think you're right. Occupy did something, and it created, you know, want to call it a meme. They created, you know, they turned it into a mass question. I think then trying to actually take that into thinking about real changes and something concrete, I think it will be a challenge, right? So no, it's the vision we want people to grasp. Right, in terms of thinking about mass transportation for the masses. That then will benefit everyone. It's re-looking at the 40 projects that LA Metro's got that's really trying to rebuild rail out into the suburbs or expand highway, expand the 710, and it's really saying, no, actually, we may have to re-look at every single one of those projects and create bus rapid transit that's cheaper, that can get people to job schools and healthcare centers. You know, I'm not trying to say we're great and savvy in terms of being able to reach everyone, but we're not trying to reach everyone. We're trying to represent, and maybe it's not like we're not trying to. We want to hold our vision and reach out to everyone with our vision. And we're not going to start by saying we want everyone to agree with us first. That's what I meant by, we don't want, our goal is not to have everybody on the table and ensure that they're on the table. We're presenting a vision that we think is a good use of public dollars, a good vision in terms of, environmentally sustainable. It's actually the better mode, and then we're trying to hopefully win people over to that vision. That, yes, starts with the needs of the folks who are most impacted, but I think you'll see it benefits everyone. You go to Paris, you go to Seoul, people are talking about bus rapid transit, right? But it's not the dominant idea. They want rail lines, they want the construction dollars, they want the transit-oriented development. And they got millions of dollars to sell that, right? And we're scrappy. And so in some ways, I'm drawing a distinction mainly for this room. But yeah, we're trying to reach out to people with the vision, but not everybody's going to want it, right? It can't say, yes, you can have your car in this vision too. And one of the things you really just think about is we may talk a lot about the 99%, but we don't talk about that, we're the 1% of the world, right? The folks in the 99% here in the US, it's 1% of the world. I mean, in that sense, in terms of who's hindering progress in terms of the rest of the world, in terms of the U.S. consumption and production, being 5% of the world's population, expound 30 to 35% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, right? And so that really will reforce us to rethink about what we think is possibleness to envision inside a city or envision inside what we're going to be supporting in terms of public dollars. I think it's going to force hard questions. And I think what your challenge to us is right. It's like, how can we do it in more creative ways, right? How can we do it in ways that actually reach out? But they first got to want the vision.
That, just real quick, that want comes from values, core values, and that's why we talk a lot at Take Back the Land about human rights, because it speaks to core values. So, we in this country, what is it? We're a me-first society. I said that earlier when I stood up, and we have to change a little bit. And it goes back to the question the young man asked, what is community? Well, community is when we have a shared value and we all want the same things and we're living and existing together, and what our community provides is equitable for all of us. It works for all of us. We participated in the process. Core values, folks, so that's a lot of work. And, the vision is there. I don't think any of us have any, vision that we're going to drop it and everybody's going to change tomorrow. No. This work is constant and ongoing and always will be ongoing. But I think core values, especially in this country, is at the crux of a lot of the struggle and a lot of the change that people want to see. Your values have to change. For me personally, and I'll share this with this group, having been homeless transformed me in my life, right? So I know for 3 years, I knew what it was to be without. And I was able to exist. So if I don't freak out like the rest of my family does, right? They don't have something, they don't know how to survive. I was forced to survive for 3 years without. It changes you, it transforms you. And I think values in this country need to be transformed within us, so.
I see that, yes, Charles.
Hi.
We have 2 more questions left.
Okay. I'm going to ask a broad question, but why do you believe we as Americans have become so passive about the state of ourselves and our inability to really produce action? I was reading about the Roman Empire and reading about Nero while Rome burned, and that they reclaimed all that space and he wound up building it, and I could just draw reflections to Bloomberg and the privatization of our public space and the consistent redevelopments. And how do we bridge people complaining about action, complaining and not actually taking action? How do we bridge that gap to actually enrage, to get people mobilized to do things, and to get the mass of the people and trying to get the numbers?
There was another question in the panel that there was somebody that stood up. Yeah, yes, please.
Yes, hi. I just want to thank the panel for being here this evening. I found their comments to be very informative and entertaining also. My name is Michael LeBrun. I've been involved for 4 years with a coalition of groups that have stopped fracking from entering New York State. And I'm looking forward to seeing as many people here as possible tomorrow to talk about how we can link this movement together with other organizations and movements here in the city to deepen and strengthen that. I'm on the board of an organization called Damascus Citizens and also a principal in another organization called New Yorkers for Sustainable Energy Solutions. Hope to see you all tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I guess we answered Charles' question. There was another one. Yes, the last one.
We'll take it and then answer.
We'll take it in.
I just had a question regarding public education and how to include charter schools in the fight against privatization of public education. Because what I think the strongest points on the other issues is the movement against the privatization of public transportation, privatization of housing, but it seems to be very contentious between charter schools and public schools, and I'm wondering how that can be reframed to the privatization, like private schools in general, and how, like, what your work has been. Maybe you've already kind of included that. I just didn't, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, charter schools are growing really super fast in New York and Chicago and other cities. But in New York City, they still only represent 5% of all schools that New York City students, public school students attend. And charter schools actually have been the site in New York State of more reform than the public schools have been, oddly. So because of the strong movement that's risen up against them, they now have to reflect the communities that they're a part of. Doesn't necessarily mean that parents have the same rights as they do to stay in a charter school once they're admitted, so they can be kicked out, just to, and the charter schools often turn over their populations in order to improve their test scores. But they do have more laws and regulations requiring them now in the last year in New York State to reflect and serve the communities that they're part of. And so now actually one of the worst charter corporations in New York City, Harlem Success Corporation, which Eva Moskowitz runs, she runs many in District 3, and she actually cites the segregation of public schools in District 3 as a reason that charter schools need to exist in District 3 now, right? And she's done that publicly. So clearly we need to make it a joint fight, but to identify charters as the only front of fight, as the only front of the fight, isn't what we need to do. But in cities like Chicago, clearly, I mean, with the strike that they were able to pull off in early September, shutting down the city schools for 10 days, yeah, there's a lot that we have to fight around to protect and make sure it doesn't get charterized, but at the same time, we have to make sure that our struggles are locally waged and that they're addressing the local conditions of the schools in our communities.
I guess we'll leave this Charles' question.
Yeah. No, but I just want to, just in terms of, just to add on to the charter, I think we do need to fight against the privatization of education. And I think the question may be, instead of thinking about it, is how do we make them community-run schools, right? How do we make them public community-run schools, and in that way have more community drive, input, reflect the students who are going, think about it as critical education. And I think in that way, there's much more room to think about what we can envision.
So early on, one thing that oriented me in the Right to the City Alliance was a statement that some of us had sat down and came up with one night as we were, I believe we were in Rhode Island at a march on the mayor's conference, and it was a phrase, and it answers your question, how do you mobilize people, or how do you organize people? And this statement says a lot, and it also talks about folks working together. Gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. If those steps or that path can't motivate you or get you to organize around particular issues and show an interconnectivity, I don't think anything will. It's that's it. It's that simple.
Yeah, just I've been working on a manuscript for a number of years called Queering the X, James Baldwin, Malcolm X in the Third World. And at the conclusion of one of the chapters, I talk about the interposition of James Baldwin's demand that in order to achieve our country, we must come together as lovers, to achieve our country. And then interposing that with Malcolm's own sensibility in terms of thinking about going to Mecca and eating from the same bowl, being naked with, sharing the same space with people who are the lightest of white or of different colors. And I think that that's really the question in terms of the question of privatization and public space, right? Because what we're really talking about is not only the privatization of actual private space, but privatization of our own desires, right? In the ways in which even social services are handed out. When you're dealing with FEMA, you get a check as an individual homeowner to which you give that check to a contractor, right? And then there's the other side of that, which is a much more communitarian response, which is Occupation Sandy or what have you, where people are developing that. So I think that one of the things that we have to do as a movement, as, using that term again, as a movement, both a noun and a verb, is really be able to rethink the ways in which we overcome both the privatization that we see, but also the privatization of our very own desires and our imaginations as a stepping point towards moving towards the city that we really want.
Thank you, Senator.
Just one last thing, I think to think about what can move, I think we really need to think about grassroots internationalism. So, you asked earlier around movement. No, we don't maybe have movements in that same sense of the MST claims 1 million members, right? They have housing sites throughout Brazil, right? I mean, in that sense of a movement, helped found La Via Campesina, which has 140 million members throughout the world. And I think if we think about, I think what is really challenging is part of this challenge of reconstructing and re-envisioning the city is a counter-hegemonic task. It's a counter-hegemonic experiment. And so in some ways, it's harder for us to imagine trying to get a whole inside the US because we're very vested in this material reality. But if we think about it more in the construct of a grassroots internationalism, I do think that there's much more bigger movement that we could be a part of.
Fantastic. Well, I guess this sets the tone for your task tomorrow in the workshops. Tomorrow we start, I believe, at 10. It's at the New School Tishman Auditorium. The address is on the website. And it's all day, so eat well and get some coffee. Thank you very much. I think it was really a wonderful, wonderful day.